TopMedTalk.
This is TopMedTalk, the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. The EBPOM World Congress is taking place this year between the 7th and the 9th of July at the British Library in London. Check out ebpom.org now.
Hello and welcome to TopMedTalk. I'm Kate Leslie, your host, and I'm here with Professor Rupert Pearse from the Queen Mary University in London to do a periop profile. Welcome, Rupert.
Morning, Kate.
I wondered if you could start by telling us what your current roles are.
Professor of Intensive Care Medicine at Queen Mary University of London, which is a university based in East London. And I'm a consultant in intensive care medicine at the Royal London Hospital, which is in Whitechapel in East London.
In our periop profiles, we love going back right to the start and hearing about the childhood and education of our leaders in perioperative medicine. Can you tell us where you grew up and went to school and how you got to become a doctor?
I grew up in a county called Bedfordshire in the UK, a rural county. I'm a farmer's son, and I spent most of my early years in and around the farm, helping my dad with various farm work. Farming is tough. It was certainly tough then. And not unlike the experiences of like a few other people you've interviewed for these. An experienced childhood that's difficult at times. As the youngest of four, my elder brother, who was 6 years older than me, was always the anointed one who would inherit the farm. So primogeniture alive and well in my family. And that created a sort of interesting situation. Number one, a lot of, I think, of the energy of developing my brother as a farmer and the relevant one to my family. He was also bigger and stronger than me, but in a farm context was quite, made me look a bit useless. So, there was this sort of expectation to work on the farm, but not the original university plan was to study agriculture. And in UK universities, you have to kind of do a 4-year course in agriculture. But if you're a farmer's son, you get a year off because you've already got that sort of farming experience in spades. So it seemed like a quick win to get to university and get out the other side and get my own job and have my own life. But quite late in my school career, very late indeed, I was chatting with a friend who actually ended up going to the same medical school as I did. And they were applying for medicine. And I was like, wow, medicine, you have to get like absolutely the top grades in your A-levels. The A-levels are the exams we do to get into university at the end of school. And as you had to have absolutely the highest grades possible to get in, how are you going to do that? It says, well, no, you don't. It is the grades you need are much lower than that in some universities. And, was certainly well within what I thought I might get if I tried really hard. So quite late in the day, when I had all these places at university to study agriculture, I changed the plan completely. So with only sort of 6 months to go before my exams, really, and suddenly started really hitting the books really hard to try and get some reasonable grades. And then I reapplied. I took a year out from university. I spent the year partly working in a hospital as what was then called an auxiliary nurse, which is such a low-level job that they don't even have it anymore in the NHS. And the other half, I was a living carer for a disabled person who was a sort of family friend. And in the midst of that, I retook one of my A-levels because it wasn't quite strong enough and applied to get into medical school and ended up getting a place at St George's, which is in South London. And it all went from there.
What was it that attracted you to it? Did you have a great GP or any great family friends or anything who were doctors?
The closest thing I had was a great grandfather who was a dentist, and he was actually the person who made all the money that bought the farm, but I'd never met him. He died long before I was born, and he wasn't somebody that was taught about much. No, I mean, I loved science. I'd always loved science at school. I was, like a lot of people, lucky enough to have one or two really fantastic teachers who could see something in me that I perhaps couldn't quite see myself. So I think it was a change in belief, if anything. There's an advert on the UK. Everyone remembers a great teacher. Certainly I remember those two people. They're quite inspiring. They clearly love their topic, and they clearly love students who love their topic too. And like I say, it generated a bit of belief. And certainly that's something that I try and think of with younger colleagues now. But lots of people around us who have all the talent but don't realize they've got it, or don't believe they've got it, or that they look at other people who are maybe more brash, more seemingly intelligent or seemingly capable, and sort of diminish themselves around that, when actually they're often got more potential to be outstanding doctors and scientists. And mentoring people has become something that's quite important to me, certainly.
You went to medical school at St George's, and was that when you got into research, or was that later on in your career?
Well, I did something called an intercalated BSc. So in the UK, standard medicine is 5 years, and you get sort of 2 degrees, a Bachelor of Surgery and a Bachelor of Medicine at the end of that 5 years. But you can sort of translate your preclinical basic sciences into a degree of itself by doing an extra degree in the middle at year 3. And I did that, and I did a project on the microcirculation. It was actually the microcirculation of aging in the skin. So I studied the difference between photoaging of sun-exposed skin and normal aging, and what happened to the microcirculation and all of that. And that was my first research. I loved that. I really enjoyed that.
That was in the laboratory.
It was sort of healthy volunteers, sort of older healthy volunteers and younger healthy volunteers.
You should have come to Australia. There's plenty of Asian sun-affected skin over here.
Well, one of my supervisors was an Australian dermatologist, so he talked a lot about the importance of this in Australia at that time. This was a long time ago. I think recognition of it's even stronger now. But at that point, recognition of the risks of sun exposure in Australia. Australia was the place that was telling everybody about the problem, and nobody else really realised in quite the same way. So, that was a learning. And then when I went through once I qualified, I went through my medical training, an opportunity came up to do some research in ICU with David Bennett and some of his colleagues. And that's when my research career started.
And did you do your MD or PhD at that point?
Yes. So I'd always wanted to do ICU as a career. And David Bennett, as you know, had a big interest in this concept of goal-directed therapy, of using cardiac output monitoring to guide fluid and inotropes in patients having surgery. They'd done some really important work on that. And David, along with Mike Grounds and Andy Rhodes, supervised me through what we would call an ND-Res, but it's a PhD for doctors, basically. And I sort of led the study on a day-to-day basis that they'd designed and learned about clinical trials and all sorts of stuff at that point.
And what was the study about?
It was a little single-center study where we used a sort of minimally invasive cardiac output monitoring. It was quite new back then. At the time, everybody was using the pulmonary artery catheter, which had developed quite a bad reputation, mainly because in the States, people charged to use it and they were massively overusing it so they could overcharge. And what we're trying to do is just unravel that and show that this is about a technique of giving better dosing of fluid and inotropes. It's not about the catheter. That had some impact. It didn't have a huge impact. It got into a journal called Critical Care, which was a specialty journal. It wasn't a big general interest journal. But it was my first proper exposure to clinical research in patients, and it was quite important for me.
What was it that attracted you to intensive care, and why did you choose anaesthesia as the sort of route into that? Because I think even back in the olden days, there were, multiple routes into intensive care medicine in the UK, weren't there?
I've always, through medical school, been fascinated by physiology. That was always the same. I really, really enjoyed physiology, respiratory, cardiovascular in particular. But in general, that was always the topic I enjoyed most. And of course, intensive care was, to me, the most obvious clinical application of that interest and that knowledge. And, I found myself doing my anaesthetic block in my undergraduate training and was chatting with a very nice and supportive anaesthetist and asked advice and said, well, the great majority of people do anaesthesia first and then access it that way. There were people who accessed it in different ways, but again, to me, they seemed like real high flyers, and maybe that was a bit much of a risk for me. I thought, the conventional route for anesthesia was the best. But that's not to diminish anesthesia. I loved my anesthetic training. I learned a huge amount and did some really important stuff. And things like obstetric anesthesia, I really loved, and I felt, it was incredibly rewarding. A lot of stuff I learned, I felt was really important.
Well, just jumping sort of to the present briefly, I imagine that your interest in intensive care might have changed, from a fascination with physiology to possibly something else. You wrote a lot and spoke a lot during the pandemic about the human cost of the virus and the illness on everybody. And I hear a lot of intensive care doctors, when they're getting more mature in their profession, they get fascinated by the impacts on people of critical illness.
Yeah, of course, my fascination with physiology was a boyish thing, really, a curiosity. And, like all of us, if you do the same thing for decade after decade after decade, you get quite good at it. And as you get good at it, you've got more time to think about other things, and you've got more time to notice other things. So when your junior colleagues who don't have that quite so much experience and opportunity to learn are more focused on the technical stuff, you get to the answer on the technical stuff quite quickly, and you've got time to see the real person in the bed, their family, their loved ones, and so on. So you start to be much more motivated by the individual stories of the lives of the people that you're trying to help. And, I see medicine as just being an incredible privilege. You're part of massive life events for people. And seeing that as a privilege, as a duty, as a responsibility to be the person they need at that particular time, it becomes, it takes over as the motivation. I think that's fair. And COVID accelerated that, some of the tragedies that you see, and in particular, the fact that you're looking after people who don't have their loved ones around them. So all of the way in which we look after people socioculturally who are really ill was just completely blown away. All they had was sort of you, the nurses, the physios who are there. And you realize that's not quite good enough. Again, you start to focus on what people really need from you as a person rather than as a physiologist with a medical qualification. Not that they don't need that too. But yes, you realize that a lot of what you do, junior colleagues can do really, really well. I don't need much help from me to dose the right medicines or to do those things. But help seeing that patient, the human they are, and how to make sure that they have the outcome they need is more challenging.
How did being one of the faces of the pandemic in the UK affect you? How did you cope with that and get through it?
It was an incredibly busy time. We were, at various stages. I was working full-time clinically. I was R&D director for my university and trust, which was almost a full-time job as well. And trying to tackle the issue that hospitals were completely closed and nobody really knew what happened inside them. And trying to help people understand that we were there. We were turning up every day. We were looking after their loved ones, and we were taking that job incredibly seriously. Became really, really important. And then after the first wave, as you probably realize, there was this wave of disinformation, COVID denial, skepticism that anything was really happening. Pretty much any loon with an axe to grind was turning into a COVID denier and getting on social media saying it was all made up and the hospitals were empty and all this nonsense. And what society really needed was trusted voices who could just say, this is what's happening and this is what I see. So rather than getting into sort of arguments, just sort of saying, well, you can say what you want to say, but this is what I'm seeing, and this is what I did today. And these are the people I looked after today. And also giving a first-hand account of what we were seeing in terms of COVID numbers became really, really important. Because people people didn't trust our government, frankly. And there are reasons for that. It was quite a right-wing libertarian government, and it was quite a divisive government. Lots of people supported it, but lots and lots of people really strongly didn't support it. There were questions about the ability of our government leadership. And so simple doctors in individual hospitals saying, this is what we're seeing, became really, really important. And so on social media, I ended up with lots of quite well-known journalists following me, lots of quite well-known actors and following me on Twitter just to find out what was going on. And as the anxiety within the NHS about any kind of comms led to suppression of any of that kind of sharing of what the reality was, became harder and harder to get the message out. And I ended up working with the Intensive Care Society, which is our UK membership society, in a small group of folk who did interviews with mainstream media and ended up doing some of the more difficult interviews and sort of on pretty much every mainstream TV news outlet, every mainstream radio news outlet. Just saying this is what's happened and this is why it's working the way it is. Yeah, that became quite important as well.
It did a great job. So, we're all very grateful. So let's turn now to something on a brighter note. Your stellar career as a clinical, epidemiologist and clinical trialist. And I think the studies that I've enjoyed the most of yours have been the international cohort studies looking at surgical outcomes. Such a tremendous sort of suite of projects. I think starting with USOS, was that the first one?
Well, I'm really an accidental epidemiologist and I hesitate. So I have absolutely no training at all. But, it started with this belief that it was an intervention that could help a particular patient group and being met with a response from lots and lots of quite important key opinion leader clinicians saying, well, this high-risk surgical patient, it's not a problem. Now, for us these days, everybody knows it's a problem. Perioperative medicine is a thing. Almost all high-income country hospital departments have perioperative medicine as a function. They see patients in outpatient clinics before they have their surgery, and all of that is so normalized. But back then, there was almost denial about it. And I think there was this confusion that everyone was making an assertion it was quality of care that was the problem. This is not quality of care. The quality of care has generally been very good. It's the fact that people are older, they've got lots of comorbidities, and when they undergo the stress of major surgery, it's not surprising that they end up getting medical complications like infections or myocardial infarction and so on. That shouldn't be a surprise to us at all because we see it in other types of critical illness. And so as an ICU doctor, it didn't seem any different to sepsis or trauma or all the other causes. But for some reason, everyone was pretending it didn't exist, even though obviously the patients were there in the ICU. So the need was for some sort of epidemiology to describe how big an issue it was. And because the surgical population is enormous, in the UK, we do 5 million surgeries a year. And the high-risk surgical population compared to it is quite small. It's like maybe 10, 15%, depending on how you define it. So you had to have something really at scale. We didn't have the routine data. So we took this idea of just recruiting every patient you could in 1 week. And so that you got the full denominator of all surgery, which was always the challenge, getting the full denominator. So every patient for 1 week and just send us some really basic data on every patient. And so we had a rule that it was 2 sides of A4 paper. So if it didn't fit on 2 sides of A4 paper, we wouldn't ask the question. And if you wanted to add something, you had to take something else off so it could fit on 2 sides of A4. And I think that valued the researcher in each hospital. And I think that created a lot of belief that we valued their time, low percentage burden on. And also, most hospitals could drive that for a week. They could pull out all the stock, make it work. Whereas if you've got studies that last months and years, it's very hard to sustain that. But for a week, people could do it. And it just caught the wind as a method. It was incredible with USOS. How much engagement there was. And we were watching the recruitment numbers click up on our website that generated patient IDs, and it just went insane. And we just couldn't believe how many people were getting recruited. We now regard a 45,000 patient study as tiny, but back then it seemed like bigger than I could ever imagine. And so that method turned out to have real value around the world. And then we went and did something called the International Surgical Outcome Study. And then Bruce Bickard, as you know, took the same method and applied it in Africa, which is the most incredible study I've ever seen, actually, the ASOS study.
What were the key results of USOS and ISOS? And then how did that compare to what Bruce and you and your colleagues found in Africa?
Well, I mean, the key result of USOS was that the mortality rate was higher than most people wanted to believe it was, but they didn't have data. It also identified, and there's some big learning for me, and I've learnt it, about how we deliver these messages, but it identified 4 countries as being outliers in terms of mortality. They were named in the paper, and they were named in the abstract, and that was Ireland, Latvia, Poland and Romania. And in Ireland, Latvia and Poland, they got very, very upset about the results. It created a lot of controversy. There was a lot of correspondence to the Lancet about it. Questions about the veracity of the data. Very, very hard, very, very challenging. And it took quite a long time for that to settle down. Meanwhile, in Romania, they took the data to the Ministry of Health and said, look, we need more investment in perioperative care. And they got that investment. So the country that benefited the most from USOS was the one that didn't challenge the results, but accepted them.
So Poland and Ireland and Latvia were very upset, but Romania was happy.
There was a lot of concern that the data were inaccurate. There were challenges to the data, lots of correspondence in the journals. And so 3 countries basically said the data are wrong. They're not accurate. They don't apply to us. And 1 country took the data to their Ministry of Health, explained, used them to represent that there was a problem in the quality of perioperative care that they could deliver, and used that to drive more investment in perioperative care services. So the irony is that the countries that challenged the data didn't benefit, and the ones that accepted that there was a problem did benefit. In the end, there was just the letters went on and on and on, and I got a phone call from an editor at the Lancet and said that we've had another letter and we're getting a bit fed up with this now. You know, you've got to answer this all honestly. And I did. I wrote the most honest and frank letter. I wrote it. It was my own letter. I didn't get my co-authors to write it with me. I just wrote what I felt and what I thought and what I believed. I still feel that's one of the best things I've ever written. It drew on other sources of evidence. It explained why the mortality rates in that particular study looked high. It was about the way the patients were selected into the study compared to other studies. And after I wrote that letter, no one ever wrote back, but they really put a lid on it. So there were real lessons for me about how you disseminate difficult findings that challenge. And certainly I think it's really important to work with people when you've got difficult messages rather than just dropping it on them as a surprise. I think that's really important. Learn that from those early days. But I think also there is still a need to speak truth to power. And you can't just hide something that's difficult because it's difficult. We have to find a way of moving forwards, because ultimately we all devote our careers to improving the quality and the quantity of life that people get out of surgery. If the care we're giving leaves some people exposed to getting worse outcomes, not better, then, it's our job to tackle that.
And what did you find in ISOS? Was it similar to USOS? So ISOS was international. In Australia and New Zealand participated, as well as countries all over the world.
Yeah, ISOS was global, and we focused only on elective surgery. And what we did that we hadn't done in USOS was to collect data on complications. ISOS wasn't quite a controversial study as USOS, and so it didn't get quite the same journal publication, which is always interesting. But to me was equally important because it just added acuity to that picture. It added understanding. And what it really helped us do was see that, people weren't dying on tables, as it were, during surgery. What was happening was that it was the ratio of complications to deaths. So this idea of failing to rescue, in some countries, people were having complications, were getting treated and were surviving. In other cases, people were having the complications and weren't surviving. So it was how systems respond to the patient who gets the complication that was defining countries with good mortality rates with less good mortality rates. And that's turned out to be a real theme in the global south, in Africa and America as well.
I remember hearing Bruce Picard present the ASOS results at a meeting in Europe before they were published, and was just blown away by the results, which I'll get you to summarize in a tick. But it was such an emotional experience. It was such an unusual event to feel all worked up about something at a scientific meeting. And of course, Bruce has such a strong but humble way of, presenting his work. So what were the highlights for you of the ASOS study?
So Bruce had been a friend for a while. He'd seen the USOS study and ISOS study, and what he wanted to do was repeat that in Africa. He delivered that across Africa and got incredible engagement in African countries. And it just goes to show how there are passionate clinicians all across African nations who are really devoted to giving the best possible care to the people in their hospitals as well, and got huge engagement. It's the most impactful study I've ever been involved with. It was just incredible. Some of the countries that contributed were in the midst of civil war. You can imagine how important it must have been to the researchers in those hospitals to do that study, given the context that they were working in. And I suppose my key contribution to ASOS was helping Bruce, who was so in the weeds of the data and getting the data out and getting the data clean, that he couldn't necessarily quite see what he'd found. And basically what we did was we benchmarked it against the ISOS data. And when we did that, it was really obvious that patients having surgery in Africa, they're younger than the global average. They have lower ASA scores, that are fitter than the global average, and they're twice as likely to die. And Bruce now presents that in a slide with basically one gravestone versus two gravestones, and says that's the key finding. And that simple message I think is what has allowed ASOS to have such a huge impact in Africa. And I think, again, what's really interesting is that nobody challenged the findings. They just accepted them and got on with fixing stuff. And I think that's why Bruce's work has been so impactful subsequently, because there's just widespread agreement about the existence of the problem. And it's just, how are we going to solve it now? And Bruce has gone on to do a whole series of very high impact studies as a result. And he's very lucky that he's taken me along for the ride, and it's been very interesting and enjoyable part of my career for sure.
It was the foundation of USOS and ISOS that really sort of smoothed the path, I guess, for acceptance of high quality data like this as real and needing action. And I'm not alone in thinking that you deserve praise, because you got a gong recently. An OBE. You're not Sir Rupert, which has a sort of certain ring to it, but tell us about when you got the letter from the king or whoever sends it to you saying you got your OBE.
Yeah, like most people, I'm not doing it for personal glory. In fact, I find the personal glory very uncomfortable. I'm doing it because I see something that's really important and, want to do my bit. But you get a letter that basically sort of asks you if you would allow yourself to be nominated. So,
did the envelope have years and things on the back?
I think it came from the Cabinet Office, so it had on Her Majesty's service. There is this period of, why should I be recognised? And there are so many other amazing people who do things just as important as I do, and more important, who aren't recognised. And yeah, that was actually quite hard. I talked to a few people. One of the people I spoke to, Ramani Minasina, who also had been awarded an OBE. And I think Ramani made the point, which was that you're kind of accepting this on behalf of all of those people you're not accepting it personally. It's the way that you represent your tribe of care doctors, nurses, therapists, and so on. It's not just you. And so I see it as something I picked up on behalf of everybody, but on behalf of myself.
So in the last couple of minutes, what's next? What's exciting you about medicine and research at the moment and in the near future?
I think the first is building my group and supporting my group in East London. And I've been very lucky to have some absolutely fantastic young researchers join our team, which is grown quite big and quite impactful now. We do a whole range of different research and different research methodologies. There's increasing focus on health equity issues and supporting those as well. So there's all of that. I continue to work with Bruce and support Bruce and other colleagues in Africa and Latin America doing global health research, and that remains an important thing of what I do. Then the other big category is just trying to give something back through senior leadership and trying to create an environment where others can succeed, and using, the influence that I've got at the position I am in my career to try and create a way of supporting the underrepresented people in our research workforce, in our medical workforce, to succeed as well, so that, our talent, it represents a full breadth of what talent there is to offer us.
And so the other thing you are doing is leadership.
So, yes, one of the lovely things about getting to my stage of the career is that a lot of the real challenges and things you need to focus on when you're at an earlier stage are reasonably secure. And that security gives you a bit of bandwidth to be able to do other things and influence things in a way that's important for you. And working to create an environment for others to succeed becomes a way to have real, genuine impact. So it's not your own work, it's the work other people do, but you've been able to create an environment where they're able to succeed and do that work themselves. And that's become something that's very rewarding. It's very inspiring, some of the people you get to work with and help. And certainly, and not just in intensive care and anesthesia, but across the whole breadth of research, I've taken on more roles where, in effect, I'm helping others to get them done, help ensure that those opportunities are fair, and that the people who maybe are underrepresented in our research and clinical workforce get that opportunity to make their contributions. And often these are people who are incredibly talented, but for various different reasons aren't necessarily either getting the opportunities or able to take the opportunities up in quite the same way. So mentorship has also become something that has been quite an important part of what I do in terms of helping those people succeed and making sure that they get the crack of the whip. And that of course is really important. They bring a different lens. Different people bring a different lens. They see things that I don't see, or maybe you don't see, identify problems that are really important that are under-recognized.
Well, Rupert, it's been fantastic to talk with you and hear about your fascinating journey. And we hope that everyone listening to this podcast agrees with how impactful your career and inspiring it's been. You can find our podcasts on our website, on our app. We're also on all of the socials. If you go to YouTube, please subscribe and give us a big thumbs up. And we'd like to thank our sponsors, which at the moment are BD and GE. So thanks once again, Professor Rupert Pearse, and thanks for listening.
TopMedTalk.
TopMedTalk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, evidence-based perioperative medicine. Join clinicians from around the world at EBPOM World Congress 2026 between the 7th and the 9th of July at the British Library in London. 3 days of evidence-based perioperative medicine, global insights and expert debate, featuring speakers including Michael Marmot and Ken Rockwood. Go now to ebpom.org. That's ebpom.org.